In the beginning of 2000s, the viruses would be still the most dominant and most widespread type of malware. That would be a reason why anti-malware industry would be called antivirus industry and the products would be called antiviruses. Viruses would vary broadly from very primitive parasitic viruses to very advanced polymorphic viruses. There would be viruses which target Windows operating system, that would be most dominant type of viruses, but also would be viruses written to target Linux operating systems or viruses written in Visual Basic to target Office documents to infect Visual Basic marker inside. Most of the time viruses would not contain any criminal related payload and would just contain some message from the author of the viruses. However, they could also contain some destructive activity, like after infecting certain number of files that would try to destroy a computer. That you could call it as a first signs of hacktivism, where some people with cybersecurity skills would try to prove the point that maybe a level of cybersecurity is not high enough, or maybe people don't paying enough attention to cybersecurity, or maybe they liked Linux operating system and they try to prove the point that Windows operating system is not secure enough, something like that. So they're definitely a different type of viruses. So we will focus specifically on binary viruses which targeted P executable files and 32-bit operating systems. But ideas we would discuss are generic for not only for Windows viruses but also other type of binary viruses as well. The most primitive type of viruses is a parasitic virus. It finds all the benign executables on a disk. It overrides an original executable on a disk with a copy of itself concatenated with the original file. So pretty much original file is getting overridden on a disk. When such executable will be executed, the loader will first execute the virus code, and what virus would do, it would copy the attached file to the disk as a temporary file and just launch a new process for that file. This way the victim would actually not notice anything because the original file would still execute. However, every single executable would be overridden with a virus, meaning that when a victim tries to execute anything, it first executes the body of the virus. Of course, there would be more complicated viruses than just parasitic viruses, which have a slightly different technique of infecting executable files. So what would virus do when it finds the executable files on a disk? It would look at the entry point, and what very basic virus could do, there's a few options. The most simple option is entry point actually written inside the PE header. So what virus could do, create a new section and change entry point and write its own code into this new section and just write the whole virus code here at the end of the file. When the file is loaded into the memory, the virus would be loaded into memory as well. When first thread is initialized, the execution would actually start from here. It would execute all the payload of the virus, and after the virus code is executed to the needed extent, it might just create a new thread and continue execution in the background. It would jump into the original entry point. That would be the most simplistic virus, which simply just writes in the end of the file, creates a new section and changes entry point. Very easy to detect, like super simple. Anti-malware would just look at that entry point, points to the last section, which almost never a good sign, and detect the virus code and just remove the last section and reconstruct the original entry point. That's something which would be easy to detect, and that's why there were much more sophisticated viruses. The more advanced approach to infecting files for the virus would be to find an entry point, analyze the code here in entry point, and find the first or second or third jump, override that jump with its own jump into the last section, which virus would actually write to the end of the file to implement its own payload. Everything else would be the same. After the jump, it would actually execute code here, maybe create a new thread to execute the payload in parallel, and then it would reconstruct the original bytes here, right? So it would actually remove its own jump. Otherwise, if it jump to entry point, it would just run the virus code in cycle, right? So to execute the benign code, it would need to cure itself its own jump and then jump to original entry point. So this would be much harder to detect, of course, because the entry point doesn't point to the last section, so there is no obvious red flag. And if the virus is more sophisticated, then it might put the jump not in the entry point, but it might put the jump in the third, fourth, fifth jump in the code. And then it's actually very hard to detect that this jump is not legitimate jump. And that makes it much, much harder to first detect such virus and of course cure it as well, because back in the day when all the executable files would be infected on the victim's system, you cannot just remove them, as a lot of anti-malware solutions would do nowadays. You actually had to cure the files. So to cure such files would be much, much harder. If you think this is complicated viruses, wait a little bit more. We're going to jump into even more advanced viruses, which usually called polymorphic viruses. However, before we're jumping into polymorphic viruses, let me explain in the next video how actually polymorphic engine for such viruses would work and what polymorphism of the code in context of viruses means.